Welcome to the Business of Story, where we connect you with the leading minds in the art of business storytelling. Learn from best-selling authors, Hollywood screenwriters, makers, content marketers, and brand raconteurs on how to craft and tell compelling stories that sell. The Business of Story is brought to you by Emma, which provides innovative email marketing tools and services that drive brilliant results. And by Convince and Convert, digital marketing advisors and counselors to leading brands and organizations worldwide. Convince and Convert helps you gain and keep your customers online. Here's your host, Park Howell.
Hey, welcome to Business of Story. Park Howell here, and I am so glad that you are here with me as well because I get a chance to introduce you to a young lady I met late last year in October, over in LA, working with my good friend Dr. Randy Olson. At UCLA, sat in through a workshop they did, and I couldn't wait to get her on today's show, so you get a chance to meet her as well. Her name is Jade Lovell, and I mean, she is amazing. She's another one of these Aussies down under from Melbourne that came to me. They've been coming to me all year long in 2016. I can't tell you the momentum that Story is having in Melbourne because I'm meeting some of the most amazing people coming out of there. Jade is one of them. She's an award-winning neuroscientist and science marketer who has spent a decade helping scientific organizations advocate for their work. Now, in 2014, Lovell left her role as a renowned vice president of the world's largest PR agency, Weber Shandwick, after she saw firsthand how easily science could be misused for profits. She set about to do something about it, and she founded the Agency in New York City with a vision to work exclusively with science and information-based clients. Now, she's got some pretty amazing clients. They include organizations like NASA, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the National Academy of Engineering, Louisiana State University, Coca-Cola, Verizon, McDonald's, and Nike, and the list goes on and on. And when you hear from Jade, you'll see why these people just absolutely gravitate to her. You know, she was awarded Best Digital Campaign for her work with Unilever, was crowned the next MacGyver by the National Academy of Engineering, and named in Antill's 30 Under 30. She appeared with President Obama in South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, presented on science marketing at NYU and Yale, and has given speeches to Google and YouTube and hosted live TV at Harvard University. I mean, if you think that's not enough, besides starting her own company, she also has a really amazing show on the Young Turks network called SciQ. It's a channel all about science, and she's going to take us through that today when we have her on Business of Story, and we're so fortunate to have her. Now, some of the topics that Jade and I get to cover with you is a really fun one in that she calls out Steve Clayton, Microsoft's chief storyteller, and basically asks him to get with the program, to really get with the program. So you got to hear that because it's kind of fun. You'll also find out from Jade what the number one emotion is that seeds virality in a message or in your story. What do you think it is? What do you think that number one emotion could be? She's going to talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about her SciQ channel, as I mentioned, in the Young Turks network, and she will tell you the story that received over 1 million plus hits and why she thinks that is. What was it about that story that made it really take off? And then finally, we are going to review Darwinism, the evolution of how we're seeing natural selection weeding out social media channels for their lack of story performance. It's kind of an interesting look. You know, stories are what make us human. Stories are what have taken us from the cave to the campfire to where we are today. It's what separates us from all living beings. So it only makes sense that we have a Darwinism, if I said that, I didn't say that right, but you know where I'm going with it. Look at the evolution of storytelling in ourselves and how that's actually happening in the online world, in the electronic world. Are we talking AI? Not quite yet, but it's a fascinating discussion today with Jade Lovell. So let's bring her on, the founder of the the Agency in New York City, Jade Lovell. Hey, Jade, welcome to Business of Story. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, you and I got a chance to meet a month or so ago with a fellow story compadre, Randy Olson, and we had a lot of fun running around UCLA and Hollywood for a day or so.
We sure did. And I still have some excellent photos of you on the green screen, Park, that I'll have to share.
Well, I'd love to have him. Now, it's great to have you finally on Business of Story, and I understand you have quite a story to tell of something that happened in a Manhattan restaurant just a couple days ago.
Oh, no, you've seen that. So I gave someone the Heimlich maneuver in a restaurant. This poor woman, she was clearly choking, but she couldn't talk. So she's grabbed my friend really hard on the shoulder. And I didn't notice any of this happening. And my friend was like, oh, no, I don't know what to do. So she's turned to me and grabbed me and got, Jade, she's choking. And so I just jumped up and gave her the Heimlich maneuver. And I wasn't sure if it had worked, but a piece of chicken flew out of her mouth and she was fine after that. So
my God.
Yeah, she owes me her life now.
It sounds like it. Were you able to do it in one thrust, or were you throwing her all over the place?
Just one. And it was so funny because we were surrounded by people, but everyone kind of looked up and then she was fine. And then they went back to what they were doing. So all this commotion just kind of happened at one table.
What was the look in her eyes?
She had a very, I'm sure you've had the same experience, Park, and a lot of the listeners will have felt the same way. When you know something is critically wrong here and you get the really wide-eyed, panic-stricken face. And that's what she had until she was Heimlicked, and then she was fine. But I really admired her because she went on and ate the rest of her lunch.
Oh, you got to be kidding.
So she was all good.
And what did she say to you when she finally caught her breath?
She said, you saved my life. I thought I was going to die here in this crappy cafe. And I said, no problem, anytime.
No problem. Just another day in Jade Lovell's life.
Just another day. Yeah. And then I went back to work and she went back to her lunch. But it's funny how you can go, there's these huge commotions, but especially in New York, no one makes eye contact. So everyone just kind of thought, oh, I'll just go back to my work now. It's
wow.
Great. Very unique.
Give us your backstory. I mean, you have done at a young age a lot of pretty amazing things in the world of story and science, and you're a part of the Young Turks programming. Give us a little bit of a backstory and how you find yourself doing what you're doing today in Manhattan.
Sure. So I started life as a scientist. I love science. I was a neuroscientist. I studied in Australia at the University of Melbourne. But I got really tired of the way we communicate science in these long 3-hour lectures and book learning and rote learning. And I was doing my undergraduate degree at the same time as all this incredible new technology was coming out and the birth of the internet. And I thought there has to be a better way of communicating. So I went on and did a master's degree in science communication and went on to work at Weber Shandwick, the world's largest PR agency, and eventually got to the position of vice president of digital for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific, which basically means the whole world except the Americas.
How long were you at Weber Shandwick before you got promoted up to this?
I spent about 3 years at Weber Shandwick, but what's great about being outside of the US, and I'm inside the US now, but outside of the US, and particularly as I started my career in Asia, in the Asia Pacific region, that there's not as many people there that have a classical advertising training that speak English as well. So I think I was a combination of very motivated and also very lucky to be there right at the birth of content marketing, and also right at the birth of this thing we call storytelling, in not the birth of storytelling, but the birth of storytelling as this buzzword as we know it in marketing.
Yeah, and it's grown quite a bit, but I know that you have this position that public relations has been kind of reframed to storytelling without really trying, and you feel that there are a lot of charlatans out there.
That's right. I remember very clearly in 2013 at the PR agency that I was at, we were talking about marketing, and someone said, no, we don't call it marketing anymore. The new thing is storytelling. So just tell the client that we're doing storytelling and that we tell the best stories. And no one ever trained us on storytelling, on what that means, or even what a story really actually was. But we started telling everyone that that's what we did. And it wasn't just us. That was the time, I think it was, I could pinpoint it around 2013, 2014, as content marketing became a thing, storytelling became a thing as well, and telling stories on social media. But I'm sure we'll talk about it later, Park. But what's interesting is how social media has evolved over time so that now it prioritizes posts and platforms where you can tell stories. So actually knowing what a story is and the format of a story is very, very important.
Okay, we'll come back to that point in a minute, but let's keep rolling on. So you're at Weber Shandwick. You left when? And is that when you started your own agency?
Yeah, so I left Weber Shandwick in 2014. And I left because I was a scientist at heart, and I could see how easily science was being manipulated or repurposed for marketing purposes and advertising purposes. So, for example, you see a lot of skincare and hair care products that you watch their commercials, and they use these jargon buzzwords like this is sulfate free, or it has this ions or proteins. And in the back of my mind, I thought, that doesn't sound right. And so I would spend a lot of time being a scientist in these marketing meetings going, but exactly how does this product work? Because I still don't understand. And they could never really explain it. And then we'd have to go away and write these marketing campaigns. And something struck me that I wasn't quite comfortable with. So I always say I switched from being a marketer to a science communicator because I'm doing penance for all the bad marketing, but more bad science that I did as a youth.
Switch from a marketer to a science communicator. So tell us about your agency.
Yeah, so when I left Weber Shandwick, I was working with clients like Microsoft, Nike Foundation, Porsche, Rolls-Royce, Burger King, McDonald's, all of the big ones. And I left all of that world to start a science communication, or I could say science marketing or science storytelling agency, because I wanted to take all those dirty tricks that marketers use. They're not dirty tricks, they're basic human psychology. But these tools like storytelling that we use without thinking twice in advertising, and share them with scientists who desperately need to get the word out there about things like climate change, about the environment, and about sharing their research. But scientists are classically untrained in how to communicate. So I wanted to help them out a little bit to get their word out.
So your client isn't a typical business per se. It's more like, I'm looking at your site here, NASA, Scientific American, NY Sci, and some of those others.
Yeah. So the New York Hall of Science is a perfect example. They're a museum out in Queens, and they're a wonderful organization, but they're very focused on themselves and what they do. So being able to communicate out to their community means everyone's a winner. If they can communicate effectively and get people excited about coming to the New York Hall of Science, then that means more people from the community get to learn about science, more people get to engage with them, they get to share this wonderful product that they have. So usually when we think of businesses going and marketing themselves, we think of those big consumer brands, maybe like an energy company or an oil company. But museums, scientists, organizations like the NIH or the US Department of Agriculture or NASA, they're businesses in a way as well. They're not-for-profit businesses, but their product is extremely important.
So how then, I want to go back to this meeting you had at the PR agency, and they came in and said, it's no longer marketing, it is now storytelling. So what did you do to start, I guess, advancing your storytelling chops so you felt comfortable doing this?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's a lot of people out there, and I can name examples, I will name and shame, people that are trying to do storytelling and trying earnestly, but they still don't really know what storytelling is. So they're leaning on what they know to be good communication. And I'm talking about things like not speaking in jargon and being more conversational. And those are all wonderful things. In fact, I've pulled both of those examples from Microsoft's chief storyteller, Steve Clayton. Now, he's the chief storyteller of a huge organization, and he's supposed to know what a story is. If you're going to have a hat like chief storyteller, you should probably know what a story is. But then you see him get up and try and explain exactly what a story is, and you can tell he doesn't quite No. He even gives examples like the key to great storytelling is to start with a great story, which makes, yes, but not particularly
The key
helpful.
to winning the Indianapolis 500 is to start with the fastest car.
Exactly. And so you hear that and you're like, okay, that makes sense, but it's not really helping me as a business person understand how to tell a story. So I was very lucky that I ran into this wonderful science communicator and scientist turned filmmaker, Randy Olson, who has appeared before on your show and still has a wonderful podcast. So go stop listening to this one and go and listen to Randy Olson. And he has figured out what you called, Park, the DNA of story, which is the and, but, therefore template. And it goes by, people have named it different things. This isn't something that he's invented. The structure of storytelling has been around for at least 4,000 years. The earliest known recorded story is the story of Gilgamesh. But I'm sure storytelling was happening long before we were able to record it. And if you think about it, we do, as I'm sure your listeners know, we tell stories every single day. When we come home, we talk to our husband or our wife or a significant other, they say, "How was your day, honey?" And what they're saying is, tell me a story. You went out into the special world and then you did an adventure of some sort, I'm sure, and then you came back. So tell me that story. So we've been trained to tell stories for a really long time, but we haven't previously really plotted out exactly what a structure of a story would look like. Luckily, Randy Olson has kind of figured out a template to make it easy to tell stories and to identify what is a story and what is just some nice sounding information. So I was very lucky that, back to your question of how I got my storytelling chops, he was a big influence, in his book, Houston, We Have a Narrative, has been a big influence in storytelling. But now I get very self-righteous when I see people who can't tell stories wearing the hat of storyteller. I say, you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Microsoft's chief storyteller, Steve Clayton, has he ever gotten around to explaining and unpacking what a story is for people, or is he?
Oh, I hope he's listening, because Steve, you're getting so close. But he puts this slide up in all of his presentations, and you can go and Google Steve Clayton. You'll find where he gives presentations about how Microsoft is transforming and becoming a storytelling business instead of content marketing or native advertising. They're just storytellers. But the thing is that when you ask him what a story is, he puts up this slide that's like, storytelling is not corporate speak. It's conversational, not jargon. It's narrative, not words. And those sort of things are like describing story, but they're not defining story. It's not what a story is. You can tell a great story and still use jargon, particularly if you're telling your story to someone that's in your network that understands what that jargon means. I think that he's trying his best to help people to communicate with the public in the most clear and interesting way, but he has never defined what a story is. But he goes around giving these lectures on storytelling. So Steve, I hope you're out there listening, because the structure is very simple. It's and, but, therefore.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. That's basically 3-act structure, and the setup, but conflict ensues. Therefore, our protagonist has to do this to overcome.
Exactly. Or what's another story? We were at the cafe and everything was great, but then a woman started choking on her chicken. So I gave her the Heimlich maneuver and everything was fine. So that's like what the basic structure of a story is. They've called it other names in history. They've called it and, but, therefore. They've called it, you've got the rising action, the crisis and the falling action is what a lot of people learn in high school English class. So we've kind of recognized what this structure is. But until you can nail the structure, what you're doing is communication, but it's probably not storytelling.
Yeah. And you had mentioned Randy. He was on the show a few weeks ago. In fact, we recorded it the day after the election, and he talked about Trump's narrative intuition, and it boiled down to the most basic meta story you could possibly think about, and that is America used to be great. It's no longer great. I'm going to make it great again. And so many people argue with me that it couldn't be that easy. There's just no way that was it. But that seemed to be the fundamental, literally story DNA for Trump's entire campaign. It was that
Absolutely.
simple.
It's that simple. And simplicity is what we need because people are just like Steve Clayton. He's trying to describe it and he's got all these facets and it makes it more complicated than it needs to be. He'll say like, oh, a story has heroes and villains, but not necessarily. It's this simple structure. But you can grow complexity from simplicity, but until you've nailed that basic simple structure, it's not a story. And Donald Trump, unfortunately, in my opinion, he intuitively knew what a story was and intuitively was able to tell them. And by measures such as Randy Olson's narrative index, he had enormous storytelling ability. And it just naturally came out whenever he was speaking impromptu. He was telling stories and giving this vision. And that's come out since the election too, is that people have identified that Hillary Clinton never articulated a story or a vision or an inspirational message for the US, and to her detriment.
No, absolutely. And I can tell you that that episode with Randy, right following the election, is one of my top downloaded episodes ever. And I got people commenting on it from around the world because I think in some cases as he revealed what this story intuition was, this narrative intuition that Trump used, people on one hand said, oh my God, it was that simple. And then on the other hand said, that's kind of scary. And, I got some hate mail from that show too, thinking that I was promoting Trump. And I'm saying, no, man, you have to understand the magic to know how to combat the spell.
Exactly.
So if you can see what he's doing to you using narrative structure, using story, then you know how you can combat it with your own stories and your own framing and so forth.
Absolutely, Park. And that's my message to scientists as well, is that you need to understand storytelling. You need to understand how it's used as a dirty trick so that you can effectively identify it and then combat it. But if scientists, in my case, I'm interested in helping the scientists, if they don't figure out what a story is and how it's being used against them, if they can't even see it, they can't identify it, they'll never be able to combat it. And you can combat with logic and facts and reason, absolutely. Story doesn't mean fantasy, but you need to know the structures first before you can be an effective communicator. And that was exactly the same as in the case of the election.
Jade, I was so fascinated by this in that particular episode that I followed up with my retired history professor from Washington State University, Leroy Ashby, who's in his mid to late 80s and is totally on top of his game. He's living up in Spokane. And we just did a show with him comparing, and why he's so interesting to me anyways, and was perfect for Business of Story, is he wrote a 900-page book called With Amusement for All: The Study of Pop Culture from 1830 to Modern Day, and its impact on society, its reflection of society, and its impact on politics. And we cover how P.T. Barnum and Donald Trump are essentially the same individual just almost 200 years later. That everything, the way P.T. Barnum sold his truthiness and fakery, and how Trump essentially has done the same thing to get elected to the highest post in the land, which is pretty scary, but a pretty interesting reflection of pop culture and storytelling of how we believe reality TV. And in fact, that it's given us this excuse that, all right, it may not be completely truthful, but that's okay because, hey, we've got reality TV. So, we have people that are making meaning in their life and in their world by sitting in front of the boob tube watching reality TV, thinking that's reality. So when we get a president-elect up spewing anything that he wants, they just assume it's okay, whether it's truthful or not. That's kind of scary.
Well, two things on that. One is the rise of reality TV. And it's really important to know that reality TV is not reality. There are editors behind the scenes that are making stories out of this stuff because reality is actually pretty boring. So they're there picking out the pieces and putting them in such an order that they look like a great story. These are editors that turn reality into a great story that makes it really compelling. And the second is you mentioned truthiness, and it was so fascinating in this election to see the rise of fake news. But what was so compelling is that those were all stories that fit into our pre-existing beliefs. So that's why they had this great virality, is that they had three factors. Fake news was a wonderful narrative. So there were some fantastical narratives about FBI agents dying in murder-suicides. They also fit into our pre-existing notions. So they were stories that were targeted to what we wanted to hear. And they were very effective in making people angry. And research from Jonah Berger has shown that anger is the number one emotion that seeds virality. So if you can make people angry, you can make people share something. So fake news wasn't this like unknown phenomena. It was very carefully, like its success should be no surprise to marketers everywhere.
Well, what's interesting to me about it, too, is the evolution of Obama coming on in his first election, really using expertly social media to get his message out, and, the story of hope and change, and we can get out of this quagmire and live into something new. Well, Trump has kind of turned all that on its ear. Not only has he expertly used it, but he's really focused on one primary channel that gets him all the attention, Twitter. And can go out there and say whatever he wants. And again, it incites this fear and this anger that then makes it extraordinarily shareable. To your point, it seeds virality. I like that.
Yeah. Now, Trump's Twitter use is very interesting because from an evolution of storytelling perspective, Twitter is really difficult as a tool, as a narrative tool, because it only gives you a certain number of characters. So analyzing Trump's tweets are interesting in that he doesn't usually use it to tell stories. He just uses it to slander people or to say his emotion on something. He doesn't use an argument in Twitter because you can't. He says, like, this person is a numbskull or this person is really boring and don't watch it. He keeps it very, very short and sweet. But that, again, is by being so assertive and aggressive, he makes people angry and he is able to completely control the news agenda. And power to him.
Yeah, you feel that there's not real story narrative structure to it, but he's using it as just kind of a jab, jab, jab.
That's right. He's the jab, jab, jab. But by doing that, he's creating news. So the story then becomes, well, the story of if you're a journalist and you're trying to cover Donald Trump's tweets, you'd say something like, well, in the past, we never expected a politician or a presidential candidate to talk in this way, but here's Donald Trump saying this crazy thing. Therefore, there was outrage. Like, he was able to seed stories by giving them that bit, by being so surprising. He was able to be the conflict that a story needs.
Mm-hmm. I used to use a line, and now I've tempered it back, but I used to say the best stories are inspired by actual events, whether they happened or not. And it goes back to what you say, life in general is pretty mundane. And so when people come home and they answer that question, honey, how was your day? They probably are going to throw a little spice into it just to make it a little bit more interesting for all those involved around to get their attention. But when you're doing that in the science world through your work, that's pretty dangerous. I mean, you can't really do that because science is interesting in its own right, and you don't want to be shaping facts. You want the facts to stand alone, but you have to present them in a powerful way.
That's right. And science often has this real, it's hamstrung because it's often the one that has to come up with this, what's called the null hypothesis, or that nothing is happening. So often people will be like, oh my gosh, there's a conspiracy. They're doing chemtrails and they're poisoning us all using planes in the sky, spraying these chemicals on us. So that's a conspiracy that has no basis in science. But it's a great story that something is happening and there's action and there's conflict. It has a lot of virality. And so poor science has to trundle along and tell everyone, like, we've got the data and no, this isn't happening. But no one wants to hear that because that's not a story. That's you're trying to tell people that there is no story. So it's much more difficult as a message often to communicate. So I feel sorry for scientists sometimes because they've got the tougher job.
But that's why you're there at the re-agency.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
To help them do it. So what kind of advice do you give to folks, whether you're a scientist or maybe you're an expert in some area where, we suffer from that expert cronyism. I mean, we talk over our audience's heads. What do you do to help people when you truly are an expert in a field to be able to shape that down to a story that regular folks can connect with?
Well, the first is that you shouldn't focus on what you're doing. Is that you need to put your research into context. So if you're a scientist or you're an engineer or maybe you're a lawyer or you're a professional of any kind, you're a coal miner, whatever you are, and someone says, what do you do? Usually tell them specifically what you do. Like, I dig holes or I build buildings. And people that doesn't really tell them the story of what you're doing. It's not in context. So we don't really understand the relevance of why you're building the holes, or why you're digging the holes, or why you're building the buildings, or why you're doing the research. So when you talk to a scientist and you say, "Tell me about your research," they'll go, I test proteins in citrus fruits. And you think, what a load of bollocks. Why would anyone care about that? Why am I funding this as a taxpayer? Give me my money back. Science is useless. But what it really needs, what science really needs, is to put itself into context. So if someone says, what are you working on? What's your research? And you say, well, citrus fruits are consumed by millions of Americans every year. And they're very, they're a common way that we get our vitamins and minerals. But they're being threatened by this plague of unknown fungus that we've never seen before. So my research is I test proteins in citrus fruits so I can understand how to better combat this fungus and keep citrus fruits from going extinct. Now, that really helps people to not only understand the research, but also to understand the importance of that research. So putting your research into context is absolutely critical. But we know the mind is lazy, and we're not trained to do that. So it takes a lot of reprogramming to get there.
But it seems so easy that it seems like it would be something that you could just naturally do. Let's just unpack that last one for a second.
Sure.
And here's the way I think about the ABT, the and, but, therefore, because I use it with my class at Arizona State University, teaching storytelling and sustainability there. And I use it with our brand development work. And I find it has taken a while, but now you get to the point. And it's kind of in 4 steps. So let's think about those citrus growers. You want to start with like a declarative statement. And yours was what? Citrus growers produce millions of tons of citrus a year or something.
And
so that's a declarative statement that nobody can argue with. So yeah, you're right. They do. Now you want to raise the action a little bit with your and. And what was your and then?
And citrus fruits are absolutely critical for nutrition for America's young people.
So it makes it even more important. We set the stage through the and, a declarative statement, and then we've raised the stakes, the importance of that statement. Now we inflict conflict with the but. And then you said, but what?
But an unknown fungus is threatening to kill all of the citrus crops and turn citrus fruits extinct.
So essentially, we have a bit of a villain in this. We have trouble.
We've got
and
trouble.
Our reptilian minds love trouble because it gets to try on trouble as you're talking about this just to learn what it would do in case it happens to us. And what you do is in the therefore, it's the solution, right? So therefore,
I'm researching citrus proteins to understand how to combat this virus or fungus.
Yeah. And it's beautiful because it comes back to really basic brand storytelling too, that I will tell folks who business of story is it's not what you make, but what you make happen. That's what your story focuses.
And you can feel it too. You can feel it. Like if I say to you, citrus crops are enjoyed by millions of people and they're critical to nutrition. You're like, yep, got it, whatever. I'm not really turned on by that. But it's only when you say, but they're being threatened by an unknown fungus. It's only when you hear that conflict that your brain turns on and goes, I'm paying attention now. You've got me. And that's the same when you watch a movie. You watch The Martian. It's only when he wakes up on Mars and he's all by himself, and what's he going to do? How's he going to survive? It's only when trouble strikes that we really turn on. But if you're watching the first few minutes of The Martian and you just see them wandering around collecting samples on Mars, you're like, I'm not really interested. I'll give you a few more minutes to get to the point. It's the same with any film. If they spend too long kind of establishing what the characters are, your brain's sitting there going, when is this going to become interesting? We've all felt that when you're watching a film. And it's exactly the same with storytelling.
It really is, because story is ultimately our survival tool. It's what makes us human. We use story to make meaning out of the things that are happening around us, and we do it, at a minimum every 35 seconds. We're running a story through our head to try to figure out what we are supposed to do next for the survival of our being. And that's just basic function. And if we're out there just leading with data, numbers, our brain gets confused. It's like, okay, what's your point? What's the event you're ultimately pointing at that I actually have to concern myself with?
Absolutely. And the tough thing for scientists is they often have that background. They know exactly why they're doing the research. They know why it's relevant, but actually communicating that to people is the really tough part. But they don't, you're sometimes so deep into your science that you forget that other people don't know. And even other people in your field don't really understand the context of why you're doing what you're doing. And it applies to scientists. It applies to science you sometimes imagine it being quite niche, but everyone that works in museums or they work in government agencies, everything they do is based on science or evidence of some kind. But it's tough to keep front of mind what you're doing. But that's why, do you remember that story of when JFK, who had made that famous statement that we were going to send a man to the moon and bring him safely home by the end of the decade, he went to NASA to check up on their progress, and he spoke to the janitor. And he said to the janitor, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." And that's a guy that really remembered the context of what he was doing and why he was doing it. So if we can all try and be a little bit more like that janitor and remember why we're doing what we're doing, not just exactly what we're doing at this moment, we'll be much better storytellers.
Great point. I'd like to take a moment here and take a break and let our sponsors tell their stories of why they do what they do. And when we come back, Jade, let's talk a little bit about your show on the Young Turks. Been watching that. Looks like you guys have great fun on that, how that all came about and what your focus is there. And then I'd like for you to share with our listeners your approach, and this is my term, not yours, the Darwinian evolution of storytelling and storytelling platforms online. You kind of shared a little bit of this with me at UCLA a month or two ago, and I know you were still fleshing it out. So now I'd love to see where you have gone with that research and how that's coming together for you. That work for you?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, Jade, we'll be back right after this. Hey, if you like what you're hearing here on Business of Story, then you are going to love Definitive, the email from Convince and Convert that many marketers say is the most useful resource around. Each day, the team at Convince and Convert picks a topic and sends you the 3 best resources ever created about that topic. It's topical, it's timely, it's useful, so go to definitivedigest.com and subscribe for free right now. Hey, I've got a question for you. What's the best call to action button color on your website? Yeah, you probably didn't see that one coming, did you? Well, what's the best shape and sizes of your CTA buttons? And what copy gets more clicks? These questions have interrupted my sleep patterns for weeks now, until I downloaded a helpful new email marketing guide from Emma called Why We Click: The Psychology Behind a Great Call to Action. You'll learn how applying just a little bit of brain science can transform your CTA buttons into small but mighty conversion powerhouses. It covers the button color, copy, and placement that helps skyrocket click rates. Check it out at myemma.com/click. Emma helps marketers everywhere send smart, stylish email newsletters, promotions, and automated campaigns. And to help us all rest a little easier knowing our email marketing is doing its job. So check out their new publication at myemma.com/click. You, like all business leaders and communicators, have an important brand story to tell, but it's probably not being heard. There's just too much competition for our attention, unless, of course, you tell a better story. For over a year now, I have connected you with more than 50 international story artists through this podcast to help you craft your ideal brand story for the growth of your enterprise and your people. Did you know I'm also available to you for speaking engagements, brand and leadership story workshops, even for one-on-one Skype or telephone brand story strategy consults? Plus, you can begin clarifying your brand story right now by downloading the interactive DIY workbook at businessofstory.com. You see, your sales don't have to be comedies or tragedies. You can make them epic by clarifying your brand story and connecting with audiences and customers like never before. So download your workbook today at businessofstory.com. And if you're not 100% satisfied, I'll happily refund your money. And one last thought. Just remember, the most potent story you ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a good one, my friends. Story on. Hey, welcome back to Business of Story. And our guest today, Jade Lovell, who has traveled the world with her storytelling and really focused on science, not only the science of storytelling, but helping scientists share their amazing work through the stories that they tell. Now, Jade, you worked at one of the top PR agencies in the world.
Not one of the top. It was the biggest. The biggest PR agency. Yeah.
Weber Shandwick, and you were head of digital. You were running that thing.
I sure was. And it was at the time, the best time, which was when digital was really exploding. The good old days.
Marketing, content marketing. Then next thing you know, you showed up in a conference room and they said, no, Jade and everyone, it's about storytelling. Get out there and start selling stories. And so you've left. You're doing your own thing now at the Reagency. You were in downtown Manhattan. I think didn't you say you bunk in with YouTube in the YouTube facility out there?
When we record because I'm the science correspondent for the Young Turks Network. So when we record our videos, we're there as resident at YouTube Studios in Chelsea. So come and visit us if anyone's in New York.
What is the Young Turks Network?
So the Young Turks Network is the world's largest online news network. And online news, of course, is a little smaller than cable news. But to put it into context, there was more people watching the Young Turks on election night than there were watching ABC on election night. So online news is really, and it's this cult of personality too, that everyone now chooses to get their news from people that they trust, whether or not that person is actually an expert journalist or not.
Well, you are in the science world. Tell us about your show.
Yeah, so our show is called SciQ, SCIQ, and we're trying to do science and get people who wouldn't normally think of themselves as being science people, get them interested in science. So we do fun things like explain what is the true average penis size. And the story behind that is actually fascinating. So you should go and watch how we explore how Uber claims that they are the largest. They pay more than any other transportation job, and kind of break down the math behind that. We talk about why Donald Trump is so appealing and his psychology. So we're trying to really delve in, use current events and things that people are interested in, like nipples and butts and sex and politics and fun stuff, and use that to delve into science issues as well.
And I think you've got one coming up on a paper that I shared over the weekend that I got from Dr. George Pasil from ASU about the power of bullshit in communications. And there was actually a study about that.
There was. Fascinating. And bonus points to those researchers for managing to sneak a study through all the way to publication with the word bullshit in the title. I think they purposely named the phenomena a word with bullshit in the title so that they could do it. But it's something that we've all probably wondered about, which is when we use bullshit jargon. So when we use words that sound ridiculous together, like neurocognition, all those big words that that really don't mean anything, do we sound more credible? And the answer in the paper was absolutely. So people that are more gullible by certain measures are more likely to be swayed and believe things when they use those big terms or when they're basically bullshit.
Well, and what it comes down to, too, is the syntax of the sentence. So you can throw these BS bullshit buzzwords in there, and as long as it has a syntax that the brain kind of picks up on, it thinks there is something that has more heft to it than it actually does.
That's right. As long as it makes the syntax is correct in the sentence and it's grammatically correct, it sounds fancy, so we go for it, even though those words in that order might not actually make any sense.
You know, a buddy of mine, Pat O'Donnell, and I used to do when we were undergrads back at Wazoo back in the days, we'd go to parties and we would get tired of, the little, chit-chat stuff that would go on. So we would do non sequitur conversations with each other, and people would come in thinking we were actually carrying on a conversation. And the way it worked is I would simply look at Pat and go, man, did you see the size of that door when we walked in? And he said, there just seems to be horsehair everywhere everywhere. And then I would say, yeah, and I stopped dating her a couple weeks ago, but she just called. And he said, is that what happened to the flat tire? And we could go on for 5 minutes with these complete impromptu non sequiturs. And as long as they had syntax to it, people would pop in like, what are you guys talking about? And they would think we were actually had this conversation going. So maybe I proved out that science 30 years ago. I'm not sure, but it's quite fun. If you really want to have fun at a party, start a non sequitur impromptu conversation with your pal.
I don't know what kind of parties you were going to, Park, but I want to start going to those parties because that sounds like a blast.
Great fun. So how long have you been on Young Turks? How long has your show been up?
The show's been running for, we started an original series called Don't Be Such a Science. Not Don't Be Such a Science, that's Randy's book, called Did Someone Say Science? As in, did someone say steak? But instead of it was Did Someone Say Science? And when we came over to the Young Turks, we had to re-begin the channel, which was heartbreaking because you have to start from zero again. But luckily, all those science fans found us, and we're now we've had at least one video go over 1 million views. That was our Uber video. So we're starting to build an audience around people that love science, but they also want to understand what's happening in the world at a deeper level. So often the news explains what's new, what's happening. And then you need to kind of look behind the scenes to be able to put it into context and understand why it's happening. That's what we try and explain.
And what was the topic of your show that had over 1 million views?
That was the Uber one, and I think one of the reasons why it was so shareable is because people are really struggling with Uber as a new technology. And power to Uber because I love the fact that they're a disruptive technology that are giving people options in how they earn their money. However, they claim that they are the highest paying transportation job of all the transportation jobs, including being a taxi driver or being a truck driver. But when you actually take, the people that are Uber drivers are contractors, so they have to pay for their own fuel, their own repairs, their own insurance, all of that stuff. And when you take all of that into context, Uber, by our calculations, is actually one of the lowest paying transportation jobs. And when we did this video, we got millions and millions of views and we got hate mail, but we also got a lot of people writing in saying, oh my gosh, I've just lost my car, my brand new car that I bought because Uber promised that I would get this much money and I thought I could make my repayments. And now it turns out I haven't been able to because I make so much less than I thought I would. So it was very eye-opening and hopefully it reached a lot of people, which is ultimately the goal.
So Uber over the average penis size actually pulled in. Okay. That says a little bit about America.
And please do watch the penis size video because it's very interesting how they calculated the true average penis size because we do have a tendency to measure up.
Well, that's the American way. Remember, all stories are inspired by actual events, whether they happened or not. So just proving my point there, Jade, that's all. Finally, let's talk about this, what I found really interesting, this Darwinian evolution of storytelling and how some platforms may go the way of the dodo bird because they just aren't really that right platform to tell a proper story. If I got that right.
That's absolutely right. So we know that things evolve, or as Darwin would put it, species change with time. But we see technology changing with time as well. So I remember having the old Apple II with the floppy disks, and now I have way more computing power in just my iPhone. But communication and culture evolves over time as well. And Charles Darwin was the first one to figure out evolution of species. But when we look at evolution of culture and communication, we see that there's this thing called selective pressure. So if you're a species out in the environment, the selective pressures might be how well you can camouflage into your environment to avoid predation, how well you can pass your DNA onto your offspring, so how well you can mate and raise young to survive into adulthood. But for social media, it turns out that the biggest pressure is narrative. So not just posts, but also platforms. So I'll give you some examples. We did original research at Weber Shandwick, and we measured which length of posts performed the best. Now, when Facebook marketing first came out, everyone was saying short posts are the best because people have short attention spans and you've got to catch them quickly. But what we found, surprisingly, was it wasn't those posts that were 0 to 50 characters, the short posts, that did well. In fact, they actually did the worst. It was the posts that were 200 to 250 or 250 or more characters. So the longest posts in our survey were the ones that did the best. And we thought, why? Why is it that these long posts, like we know people have a short attention span, why are long posts performing better, more shareable, reaching more people? And it turned out that it was because that's how many characters it takes to tell a story. To get the and, but, therefore story structure in there, you needed at least 200 to 250 characters. And so we're finding that not only does this narrative pressure affect posts themselves, how well they're shared, but also platforms. So Twitter is being forced to evolve. It's had a decreasing luck recently. It's declining in popularity, and they've since tried to evolve by expanding the amount of characters that you can use, or basically making things like URLs not count towards your character limit, to try and make these tweets a little bit longer so you can start to try and fit in a story. But they're still struggling they have never figured out that narrative is what's causing it. So if anyone knows people at Twitter, just pass along this podcast.
So it really comes down to this 250 plus characters, and you studied this across, well, Twitter you couldn't at the time because you only had that 140 character, but this would be what, Facebook and blog posts and other places?
Yeah, so we studied this for Facebook, so how well Facebook posts are being shared. But then Randy Olson's done some original research where he looked at the ABT stories that were written by people at Union of Concerned Scientists and the Monterey Bay Aquarium and others, and he found that the average story length is around 250 characters, maybe a little shorter for us mere mortals that tell basic stories. But it's still longer than 140 characters. So Twitter is being used as a news sharing tool, but it's not long enough to tell a narrative. And if narrative pressure is what's causing posts or causing social media platforms to die out, then Twitter is doomed, because it can only be used in one dimension, which is sharing information in a very short and succinct, this happened. But it can't put things into context using a story. We're starting to see now Snapchat is evolving so that it has, Snapchat's kind of this cute tool, but they actually flat out call it Snapchat stories. They're allowing for longer connected posts so that we can actually put things into context and tell a full story. Instagram as well is expanding out the length of their videos that are available. So all of these platforms are starting to evolve so that they can be used as storytelling tools. So narrative pressure always wins.
So it really comes back to have a story, everything has to have a context around it, has to create meaning so that our reptilian brains can put it in time, place, and have a relationship to it. Otherwise, it's just more noise. We're just getting hit over the head with more information. I have seen this in TV commercials over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, when motion graphics and animation really took off and became a lot less expensive to produce. And all of a sudden you see 30 seconds of motion graphic wallpaper with Skittles flying through it or whatever, but there's no context to it. All it is like Andy Warhol selling you something through motion graphic art. And I would argue that it's not powerful because it just adds to this malaise of information and input that we're getting when our brain is really searching for context and meaning.
Absolutely. And that goes back to Steve Clayton and the chief storyteller at Microsoft. He knows that stuff is interesting and it's pretty and it's colorful, but until he figures out how to tell a story, it's not going to be as successful as it could.
Steve Jobs kind of had that down, so Microsoft is still trying to play catch up to the man.
Yes, in more than one way.
Well, Jade, thank you so much for being here. Where can people learn more about you, find your Young Turks show, the PsyQ channel, and how can they just get a little bit more Jade in their life? And especially, where are you dining this week? So if they want to have kind of a fail-safe in Manhattan, they know you've got their back, literally.
Come dine with me, and I'll make sure you don't choke. So our channel on YouTube is youtube.com/PsyQ, SCIQ, if you're interested in science as it relates to popular culture. If you're looking for more science and marketing, check out our PR agency, which is Reagency, REAGENCY, lab.com. and you'll see as that we are the storytelling and science agency out there. And you can also, if you're interested in this evolution of social media, check us out at South by Southwest this March. We'll be in Austin, Texas, talking about this very topic and how narrative pressure is really shaping social media as we know it today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on this show. It's just a pleasure meeting you a month or so ago, and it's just really wonderful having you here on Business of Story.
And we're loving your podcast, Park. We play them in our classes, so keep them up.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in today for this edition of Business of Story, where we get to bring wonderful story artists like Jay to help you craft and tell more compelling brand stories to help you nudge the world in any direction you choose. And if you like what you're hearing, please jump over to iTunes and give us a comment, a star. And we really appreciate it when you share Business of Story with your world. And of course, if you're looking for tools to help you truly hone your story and let the world know what it is, that one thing you do better than anybody else, visit us at businessofstory.com. We have a ton of tools there for you. We have up to 80 episodes of Business of Story just waiting for you to learn from. And of course, our blog post and some other fun things. So thank you again for listening. Please join us next Monday when we will have another incredible story artist just for you. And until then, have a wonderful life.
Thanks for tuning in to The Business of Story. Don't forget there are terrific free storytelling resources for you at thebusinessofstory.com, where you'll also find the complete show archive. The Business of Story is sponsored by Emma and by Convince and Convert, and is produced by Convince and Convert Media. Find more great shows like The Business of Story at marketingpodcasts.com, the first search engine for marketing podcasts. Podcast imaging by